Crawl back to your gutter. You filthy animal, you're disgusting to even look at.
I bet 1 million no one alive can outcode my engineers.
Please, just let me try.
You're only fit to lick the dirt off my shoes. Filthy stain.
The whole room roared with laughter. Security grabbed his arm. He didn't flinch.
Please believe me, gentlemen.
Fine! Let's see what this sewer rat can do.
The man sat and opened a cracked, duct-taped laptop. The laughter died as the screen lit up, and the panel turned green. And in 4 minutes, what he revealed would burn Reed's entire company to the ground. 2 blocks from the gleaming convention center, a man named Cassius Holloway sat beneath a bus shelter, watching his breath fog in the cold morning air. He had slept there for the better part of 3 years, his whole life folded into a single canvas bag. A thin blanket, a chipped thermos, and a notebook filled page after page with neat columns of handwritten code. Every morning he opened that notebook the way other men open scripture, his pencil moving across the margins, solving problems no one had asked him to solve. He did it, he told himself, only to stay sharp. The truth was simpler. It was the only thing the streets had not yet taken from him. People passed him without seeing him. A businesswoman stepped around his outstretched legs. A teenager filmed him for half a second and walked on, laughing. To the city, Cassius was scenery, a shape to be avoided, a smell to be escaped. No one who looked at his torn coat and his cracked hands could imagine the mind humming quietly behind his tired eyes. And that, more than the cold, was the thing that wore him down. Inside his coat, against his chest, he kept a photograph, creased soft from years of handling. A little girl with bright eyes and 2 missing teeth smiled up at a camera that no longer existed. Her name had been Maya. He did not look at the picture often anymore. Some mornings he could not breathe if he did. He still had his laptop, too, an old machine, its lid held together with silver duct tape, its corners worn to bare plastic. He charged it at the public library, where the staff had long since stopped asking questions, and on its cracked screen, he kept building small, elegant things that no one would ever run. Once, leaning over a stranger's shoulder at a frozen ATM, he had murmured a single line, "Your cash is colliding. That's all," and walked away before the man could turn around. The screen cleared a moment later. Cassius was already gone. Across those 2 blocks, in a world made of glass and light, another man was preparing to change the future. Maxwell Reed, founder and chief executive of Atlas Dynamics, stood at the center of a stage being built around him, rehearsing the speech that would unveil his company's crown jewel, an optimization engine called Helion, a system Reed swore would run everything from city traffic to hospital emergency rooms. Cameras swung toward him. Assistants scattered at his glance. Reed was a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, and he had never once questioned whether he deserved to be. "My team solved Helion's core in 5 minutes, he told a circle of reporters, smiling like a blade. 5. That's the bar. There's not a coder alive out there who can clear it, and I'll put $1 million of my own money on that." The reporters laughed and scribbled. Reed loved the sound. To him, brilliance and wealth were the same thing, and poverty was simply proof that a person had failed some basic test of worth. Only one man in his orbit was not smiling. Garrett Pierce, Atlas's chief technology officer, stood a half step behind Reed, his eyes moving too quickly, his jaw too tight. When a junior engineer mentioned that the company was opening its doors to the public that afternoon, letting ordinary people wander the lobby and watch the Helion challenge loop on the giant screens, Pierce's face flickered with something that looked, for just an instant, like fear. No one noticed. No one ever looked closely at the man who had everything to lose. By the time the public doors opened, Cassius Holloway had drifted toward the warmth of the lobby, drawn not by the free coffee or the crowds, but by a problem glowing on a screen 3 stories tall. He stopped. He went very still. Because the shape of that problem, its logic, its bones, the particular way it had been built, was something he recognized. Something he knew better than the men who had put it there. Something, in fact, that he had once built with his own hands. His fingers twitched against his knee, already solving it, the way a musician's hand moves to a song he cannot stop hearing. And the longer he stared, the harder his heart began to pound, because if he was right about what that code truly was, then the billionaire on that stage was about to lose far more than a bet. The public hour filled the lobby with noise. Families, students, tech bloggers, all craning their necks at the 3-story screen where the famous Hellion Challenge scrolled in glowing green. A microphone had been set up near the stage so visitors could ask the engineers questions. Most asked about salaries or selfies. Cassius Holloway waited at the back of the line, hands buried in his pockets, and when his turn came, he stepped to the microphone and said, in a voice rough from disuse, "Your scheduler is thrashing under load. The bottleneck isn't the solver, it's the caching layer." For a moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed. It was not the words the room reacted to. It was the coat, the smell, the tape on his shoes. What none of them realized was that the man in the torn jacket had just described, in 2 flat sentences, the exact flaw Atlas's own engineers had spent a week arguing about behind closed doors. But no one on that stage was listening to the words. They were looking at the coat. A young engineer on the stage, badge gleaming, smile easy, leaned into his own mic and decided to have some fun. "Okay, buddy. Do you even know what a caching layer is? Let me explain it real slow." He spoke to Cassius the way one speaks to a child, drawing out each syllable while the crowd snickered. Phones rose into the air. Somewhere near the front, a voice stage whispered, "Somebody call security. There's a bum at the mic." Cassius did not move. He had learned, over 3 years, that stillness was the only dignity the world allowed him. But his jaw tightened, and his hand drifted, without his permission, to the photograph against his chest. For half a heartbeat, he was not in that gleaming lobby at all. He was in a small apartment years ago, a little girl asleep on his shoulder, a screen glowing softly while he built something he believed would change the world. Then the laughter pulled him back. Maxwell Reed, watching from the wings, saw an opportunity. Humiliation, after all, made wonderful content. He strolled to center stage, all teeth and charm, and spread his arms to the cameras. No, let him up here. Let's give the gentleman his shot." The crowd roared with delight. "Come on, show us what the street can do." It was cruelty wearing the mask of generosity, and everyone in the room understood the joke. Everyone except, perhaps, the man it was aimed at. Reed turned the moment into a show. He lifted the giant check from its easel and held it over Cassius's head like a prize at a carnival. $1 million, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "to anyone who can outcode my engineers, even him." The crowd howled. A reporter crouched in front of Cassius and pushed a microphone into his face. "Any last words before you embarrass yourself, sir?" Cassius said nothing. He only looked at the screen, and his eyes moved across the scrolling code faster than the reporter could follow, line after line, as if he were reading a letter he had written long ago and never expected to see again. Security escorted Cassius to the stage with their hands hovering at his elbows, ready to drag him off the instant the bit grew stale. Someone produced a chair for him, then thought better of it and wiped the seat down with a cloth, slowly, theatrically, to a fresh wave of laughter. A technician held out a company keyboard, then pulled it back, wrinkling his nose. "Maybe don't touch our stuff," he said. "Prove you belong here first." Only one figure in the room was not laughing, and it was the last man anyone would have expected. Garrett Pierce had gone pale at the edge of the stage. "Get him out of here," he hissed to a producer, his voice low and urgent. "I'm serious. End this. Now." The producer waved him off. Reed was enjoying himself, and Reed signed the checks. But Pierce kept staring at Cassius's face as though he had seen a ghost, and his hands, the crowd would later notice on the footage, were trembling. He of all people knew that this was no ordinary beggar. He had spent years praying he would never see that face again. In all that ocean of mockery, one small act of kindness surfaced. A junior developer named Lucas Brown, barely a year out of school, pushed quietly through the crowd, set a paper cup of water on the table beside Cassius, and dragged over a real chair, a good one, without a word. He could not meet the older man's eyes. He just nodded once, the way you nod to someone you have wronged without knowing how, and stepped back into the crowd. It was nothing. It was everything. It was the first human thing anyone had offered Cassius Holloway in longer than he could remember. For a moment, Cassius almost stood up and walked away. The laughter, the cameras, the boy's pity. It was too much, and he was so tired. His fingers found the photograph again, the soft creased edge of it, the little face that had once believed he could do anything. He could almost hear her voice. "You can fix anything, Daddy." He closed his eyes, and then he opened them, and he stayed. The condescending engineer was still going, playing to the crowd. "So tell us, Professor, where'd you learn to code? In the gutter? Behind a dumpster?" Cassius looked up at him, calm and unhurried, and said the words that would later be clipped, captioned, and shared 10 million times. "Code doesn't ask where you slept last night." The laughter faltered, just for a second. Something in the man's voice, the certainty of it, the quiet authority, did not match the coat. People glanced at one another. The engineer's grin wavered, and up on the great screen, the challenge kept scrolling, green and patient, waiting for someone to actually solve it. For the first time all afternoon, the laughter did not quite return. A strange unease settled over the front rows, the feeling of a crowd that has begun to suspect it is laughing at the wrong man. What none of them knew was that the trembling man in the wings was about to do everything in his power to stop what came next. Because if Cassius Holloway's hands ever touched that keyboard, a secret buried for years would claw its way back into the light. Reed clapped his hands together, savoring the spectacle. "All right, let's make it official." He gestured to a technician, who reluctantly slid a terminal in front of Cassius and connected it to the live challenge feed. "Here's how it works, friend. My engineers cracked the core in 5 minutes. We'll be generous." He smirked at the crowd. "We'll give the gutter 4. Clock starts when you touch the keys." A countdown timer flared to life on the great screen, 4 minutes glowing red, and the room settled into a hush of delicious anticipation, waiting for the homeless man to freeze, to fumble, to fail. Cassius did not touch the keys right away. He read. His eyes moved down the problem the way a doctor reads a chart, and what he saw made something old and sharp wake up inside him. The engineers had attacked the challenge with brute force, more threads, more memory, more machines thrown at a wall. It was the work of people who had never had to be clever, because they had never had to be poor. They were optimizing the wrong thing entirely. He placed his cracked laptop beside the company terminal, set the creased photograph of Maya against its base where he could see her, and finally lowered his fingers to the keys. He did not write much. That was the first thing the watching engineers noticed, and it unsettled them. He deleted more than he added, 3 lines. He rewrote the constraint at the heart of the problem, collapsing a tangle of nested loops the Atlas team had been proud of into something so simple it looked almost like cheating. Where their version had needed a wall of servers, his needed almost nothing at all. Then he hit enter. On the great screen, the validation bar, which had crawled for the company's own engineers, leapt forward in a single green surge. A murmur ran through the lobby. Not laughter now. Something else. A few of the phones that had risen to mock him were still recording, and the people holding them no longer knew exactly what they were filming, only that it had stopped being funny. In the third row, a silver-haired woman rose halfway out of her seat. Dr. Eleanor Davis had taught computer science for 30 years, had reviewed 10,000 solutions, and she knew a signature when she saw one. That move, refusing the obvious, attacking the constraint instead of the symptom, was a fingerprint. She had seen it exactly once before, long ago, in the work of a young man so gifted he had frightened his own professors, a name the industry had quietly erased years ago. Her hand rose to her mouth. "It can't be," she whispered. "After everything they said happened to him. It can't be him." At the edge of the stage, Garrett Pierce lunged toward the producer. "Time! Call time! He's out of bounds! This isn't the sanctioned environment!" His voice climbed toward panic. "End it! Cut the feed!" But Reed, for the first time, was not laughing at Cassius. He was watching the green bar, and something in his expression had shifted from amusement to a narrow, predatory interest. A man like Reed could smell talent the way a shark smells blood, and it confused him because talent was not supposed to come dressed in rags. He waved Pierce back without looking at him. "No," he said quietly. "Let the man cook." Cassius barely heard any of it. His hands were trembling on the keys, and it was not fear. It was something he had not felt in 3 years. The simple, staggering relief of being allowed to think out loud. of being in a room where his mind was the thing that mattered and not the smell of his coat. His eyes flicked to the photograph. Watch this, baby girl. He pulled the next piece of the problem toward him and began, impossibly, to go faster. The red countdown ticked down, but Cassius was no longer racing the clock. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere only he could go. The engineer who had mocked him a minute ago was no longer smiling. He leaned toward a colleague and muttered, low and uneasy, "How does a guy off the street know our stack this well?" It was the question on every face in the room now, and it was the exact question Garrett Pierce was so desperate that no one would ever stop to ask. When the 4-minute clock expired, Cassius lifted his hands from the keys. The lobby toy was finished, but he did not stand up, and he did not gather his bag to leave. Instead, he looked up at Maxwell Reed and spoke the first words he had offered the room of his own free will. "Give me the real one," he said. "Not this demo. The actual gauntlet your engineers ran. The one you bet $1 million on." The crowd inhaled as one. It was no longer a beggar asking for scraps. It was a challenger naming his terms. Reed's smile thinned, but his pride would not let him refuse, not with the cameras drinking in every second. "Fine," he said. "You want the real core? Let's see you drown in it." He snapped his fingers, and the technicians loaded the true Helion challenge onto the screen. A wall of architecture so dense that several people in the audience laughed nervously just looking at it. Cassius studied it for a long moment. Then he did something stranger than solving it. He began to describe it. "Your event queue has a race condition under heavy load," he said, his voice steady and quiet, carrying in the silence. "When 2 requests hit the scheduler in the same window, it double books the worker and the whole pipeline stalls. You patched it with a timeout instead of a lock, which means it works in the demo and fails in the field." He had not been shown the internal code. He could not have been. He was reading the system from the outside, from the way it breathed, and naming the sicknesses hidden in its bones. "And your caching layer," he went on, never even pausing, "invalidates on the wrong key. Under real traffic, it serves stale data to half your users, and nobody notices until the numbers are already wrong." He spoke without arrogance, almost gently, the way a man speaks about a child he once loved and lost. The Atlas engineers went very still. One of them, the senior architect, leaned toward the screen and then jerked back as if it had burned him. Those were their flaws, the exact ones, the private ones, argued about in locked rooms, written down nowhere a stranger could ever reach. The architect turned slowly to the man beside him and whispered, "He's describing code he's never seen. How is he describing code he's never seen?" That was the moment the room turned. The mockery was gone now, replaced by a thick, electric attention. You could feel it in the air, the way a crowd shifts when it realizes it has been wrong, terribly wrong, about something it was certain of only minutes before. Phones that had filmed a joke were now filming history, and the people holding them had stopped laughing entirely. Garrett Pierce could feel the floor tilting beneath him. He shoved his way to the front of the stage, pointing a shaking finger. "This is a fraud," he announced, too loudly. "He's memorized leaked materials. He's not solving anything, he's performing. Disqualify him. The bet is void." When that failed to land, when Reed only frowned, Pierce did something uglier. He moved to the control desk and, under the cover of his own body, yanked the demo network cable from its port. The great screen flickered. The live feed to the challenge servers died. "He's lost his connection," Pierce called out, almost triumphant. "Show's over. No connection, no submission." A flicker of relief crossed his face, the look of a man who thinks he has just buried something forever. For a heartbeat, it looked like he had won. Then Cassius reached over, calm as still water, and pulled his own battered, duct-taped laptop in front of him. "I don't need your network," he said. He had been working offline the entire time, on a machine that owed Atlas nothing, his solution building line by line in a window only he had been watching. While Pierce had played his little games with cables and accusations, Cassius had quietly finished the thing they all swore could not be done. He turned the cracked screen toward the cameras so the whole world could see the code alive and running on a laptop held together with tape. The crowd erupted. Somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap, and then another, and then the sound rolled forward like a wave. It was then that Dr. Eleanor Davis could stay seated no longer. She climbed to her feet in the third row, her voice ringing out clear and certain over the noise. "I have reviewed code for 30 years," she said, "and I will stake my entire career on what I am about to say. That is not a trick. That is a signature. That is Cassius Holloway." The name struck the room like a bell. Holloway. It meant nothing to most of the crowd, just a name attached at last to the impossible man on the stage. But it did not mean nothing to everyone. Up on the platform, Maxwell Reed went rigid, the color draining from his face. The amusement that had carried him through the afternoon curdled into something cold and disbelieving. He knew that name. He had read that name. It was buried deep in the founding documents of Atlas Dynamics itself, in the acquisition papers he had signed years ago and never thought about again. A name attached to the original patents. A name attached to the very technology that had made him a billionaire, and that Garrett Pierce had personally assured him was clean. "Holloway," he repeated under his breath, and his eyes moved from Cassius to Garrett Pierce, and for the first time he looked at his own chief technology officer as though he were seeing a stranger. Pierce had stopped moving entirely. He stood frozen at the control desk, the severed network cable still dangling from his hand, his face the color of ash. He was no longer trying to stop the demonstration. He was simply staring at Cassius Holloway, like a man watching his own grave open in front of 1,000 witnesses. And Cassius, ignoring all of them, set his hands back on the keys of his broken laptop. He was not finished. In truth, he had not yet even begun to show them what he could do, or why he had really come. The room held its breath, suspended between one revelation and the next, and a single question now burned in every mind. If this man had built the very heart of Atlas Dynamics, then how had he ended up sleeping under a bus shelter 2 blocks away, forgotten, while another man wore his genius like a crown? A cameraman, sensing the story of his career, zoomed in tight on the broken laptop. And there, on the cracked lid, half buried under 3 years of grime and tape, was a faded sticker. The lens found it, and the giant screen blew it up 10 feet tall for the whole room to read. It was a small oval logo, the kind a startup prints by the hundred in its hopeful early days, and the words around its edge were still legible. Holloway Pierce Labs. The room did not understand it yet, but 2 men did. Maxwell Reed read those 3 words and felt the floor drop out of his certainty. Holloway Pierce, the original company. The little firm whose patents Atlas had acquired a decade ago, the seed from which his entire empire had grown. He had been told the founders were long gone. He had been told the work was clean. He had been told all of this by the man now standing frozen at his control desk, holding a dead cable in a shaking hand. Reed turned to Garrett Pierce, and he did not need to ask the question. Pierce's face answered it. There was no outrage there, no confusion, none of the indignation an innocent man would wear. There was only guilt, naked and absolute, the expression of someone who has spent a decade waiting for a knock at the door and has finally heard it. And so the truth assembled itself, piece by piece, in front of 1,000 phones. Once, Cassius Holloway had not been a homeless man. He had been the most gifted young engineer of his generation, a prodigy who built, with a partner he trusted, an optimization engine they called Project Helion. It was beautiful work. It was years ahead of anything else. But Cassius had not built it to be famous, and he had not built it to be rich. He had built it because his daughter was sick. Little Maya had been born with a failing heart, and the hospitals were drowning. Their emergency systems so slow and so overloaded that children waited hours for care that should have taken minutes. Cassius had set out to fix that. Project Helion was meant to be a triage engine, a system that could sort the dying from the waiting and get the right child to the right doctor in time. Every line of it had been written with her face in his mind. His partner saw something else in it. Garrett Pierce saw money. When investors came circling, Pierce moved quietly, the way a thief moves. He rewrote the ownership documents. He stripped Cassius's name from the patents, one filing at a time. And when Cassius discovered it and fought back, Pierce had the lawyers and the money and the time, and Cassius had none of those things. He had only a sick little girl and a case he could not afford to win. He chose the lawsuit. He told himself he was fighting for her future, for the money that would pay for her care. And while he sat in courtrooms losing a battle that had already been rigged, the months slipped away, and Maya's small heart slipped away with them. She died on a Tuesday afternoon while her father was across town, arguing about patents, fighting for credit instead of holding her hand. He lost the case. He lost his name. And then he lost the only reason he had ever fought at all. That was how a genius ended up under a bus shelter. Not because his mind had failed, but because his heart had broken in a place no one could see. The laptop he had kept alive all these years, the one held together with tape, still carried the original code and the sticker of the company that had been stolen from him, and somewhere in its files, the last version of the engine he had built to save his daughter. He had carried his grief and his genius through 3 winters of concrete and cold, and never once let go of either. Now he sat inside the gleaming tower that had been built on his stolen work, surrounded by the wealth his mind had created, owning none of it. The photograph of Maya rested against his broken laptop, her bright eyes turned up toward him. And the question hanging over that silent, stunned room was no longer how he had fallen. It was what a man does when he finds himself standing at last, inside the company that ate his entire life. It began with a single red light on the control desk. Reed had planned the afternoon's finale to be a triumph. To prove Helion was not just a demo but a living system ready to run the world, his team had wired it, live, into 2 real things outside the building. The first was a downtown autonomous transit pilot, a small fleet of driverless shuttles that Helion was routing through the afternoon traffic. The second was a feed from a partner hospital's emergency department, where Helion was quietly sorting the triage queue as a proof of scale. It was meant to be the moment Reed pointed at the screens and said, "Look, it already works. It is already saving the city." Instead, the red light blinked, and then another, and then the screens began to scream. The scheduler was thrashing. It was failing in exactly the way Cassius had described 2 minutes earlier, the race condition he had named aloud now unfolding in real time under real load. On the great display, the transit map lit up with a cascade of warnings. One of the shuttles, full of passengers, had lost its routing fallback. Its safe stop command, the instruction that told it to brake and hold when the system lost certainty, was simply not firing. The little icon kept rolling forward on the map, toward an intersection where the cross-traffic signal was about to turn green. And on the hospital feed, the triage queue was scrambling. Patients flagged critical were sliding down the list. A heart attack was being ranked below a sprained wrist. Somewhere in a real emergency room across the city, a screen was telling nurses to wait on someone who could not afford to wait. The laughter was a memory now. The crowd understood in a wave of cold horror that this had stopped being a show. People were in those shuttles. People were in that hospital. And the famous Atlas engineers, the best money could buy, sat frozen at their terminals with their hands hovering uselessly over the keys, because they did not have the answer. They had never had it. When Garrett Pierce stripped Cassius Holloway's name from the patents all those years ago, he had also stripped something else, something he had never understood well enough to keep. The original Project Helion had a safety layer, a failsafe Cassius had written specifically so the system would always, always fail toward protecting a life. Pierce had found it inconvenient. It was complex. It slowed the benchmarks, and he did not grasp how it worked. So when he rebuilt the engine for sale, he gutted it. For 10 years it had not mattered, because the system had never run anything that could die. Now it was running shuttles and emergency rooms, and the missing piece had teeth. Only one person alive knew where that failsafe lived. He was sitting in a wiped-down chair in a torn coat, watching the disaster bloom across the screen with terrible understanding in his eyes. Reed spun toward his team. "Fix it," he barked. "Somebody fix it." But they could not, and he knew it, and the knowing drained the last of the color from his face. The cameras caught everything. The shuttle icon crept closer to the intersection. The hospital queue inverted itself again, and then Maxwell Reed, Billionaire, did the one thing he had sworn he would never do. He turned to the homeless man he had called a sewer rat, and his voice cracked as he said it. "Please, can you stop it?" For one long second, Cassius Holloway did not move. He looked at the man who had humiliated him an hour ago, now begging. He looked at the screen where people he would never meet were sliding toward harm. And then he looked at the photograph propped against his broken laptop, at the small face that had once waited too long in an emergency room of its own. "Move," he said quietly. The senior architect scrambled out of his chair. Cassius slid in front of the live terminal, pulled his own taped laptop beside it, and began. The clock on the screen, the same 4-minute clock that had been set as a cruel joke, reset and began to count. 3:58, 3:57. But no one was laughing at it now. The whole room had gone utterly silent, 1,000 people holding a single breath, and into that silence came the only sound that mattered. The rapid, certain clatter of a keyboard. Cassius was not inventing anything. That was the secret of the 4 minutes. He was remembering. The failsafe was his. He had written it years ago at a kitchen table with a sleeping child on his shoulder, every line shaped around one promise, that the system would protect the most vulnerable person in the queue no matter what. He did not need to design it. He needed only to bring it back from the place inside him where he had kept it alive. His fingers flew. The code poured out of him faster than the watching engineers could read it. Structures and safeguards blooming on the screen in a language only he fully spoke. In the third row, Dr. Eleanor Davis had risen to her feet, her lips moving silently. She was reading the code as it appeared, recognizing each piece a half-second before it landed, and she was whispering it along with him like a woman saying a prayer she had memorized in another life. "Beautiful," she breathed. "Oh, you beautiful, brilliant man." 30 years she had waited to see work like this again, and she had been certain the world had thrown it away. At the edge of the stage, Garrett Pierce was backing away, step by step toward the side exit, his eyes wide, understanding that the very thing he had buried was rising from the dead in front of 1,000 witnesses, with his fingerprints all over the grave. 3 minutes. The shuttle icon was 2 blocks from the intersection. Cassius's jaw was tight, a single bead of sweat tracking down his temple and falling onto the trackpad. He wiped it away without looking and kept typing. He routed the rebuilt failsafe toward the transit system first, because that was the one measured in seconds, not minutes. 2 minutes. The cross signal began to change. The shuttle rolled forward. Cassius did not look up at the map. He could not. He had to trust the code, the way he had once had to trust a system he was too late to save anyone with. His hands moved on instinct, closing the last connections, and then he reached the final line, the compile, the moment where the work either lived or it did not. He paused, just for a breath. He glanced at Maya. Then he hit enter. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. And then, on the great screen, the transit feed flashed 2 words in steady white letters. Safe stop engaged. The shuttle icon froze in place, half a block short of the intersection, holding perfectly still as the cross-traffic flowed harmlessly past. A heartbeat later, the hospital queue shuddered and resorted itself, the heart attack snapping back to the top of the list where it belonged, the wrist sliding down, the system once again choosing, in every case, to protect the life that mattered most. Across the city, in a real emergency room, a nurse would never know how close it had come, or who had pulled it back. The clock stopped. 4 minutes. Exactly. A full minute faster than the team Maxwell Reed had called the best in the world, the team he had bet $1 million no one alive could beat. For one suspended moment, the room could not move. And then it broke. 1,000 people came to their feet at once, a roar of sound that shook the glass walls, applause and shouting and weeping all tangled together. People who had laughed at a beggar an hour before were now screaming his name. Strangers were hugging. The senior architect was staring at the screen with tears on his face. Lucas Brown, the boy who had brought the water, was jumping up and down and pointing and crying out, that's him, I gave him the chair." Cassius Holloway did not stand and bask in it. He sat very still in the wiped-down chair, his hands finally quiet, and he reached out and gently turned the photograph of Maya to face the glowing screen, so that she could see it too. Then he closed the lid of his broken laptop, and over the thunder of the crowd, only those nearest him heard what he said, low and steady and final. That part was never theirs. That part I built for her. But even as the room celebrated, Cassius's eyes lifted and swept the stage, searching, and his face changed. Because in all the chaos and the cheering, one man had slipped toward the door. Garrett Pierce was trying to disappear, and the reckoning was not finished yet. But Pierce never reached the door. When Cassius rebuilt the failsafe, he had not only restored the safety layer. To make it run, the system had to recompile the original module in full, the true Project Helion, exactly as it had been written a decade ago. And that original module carried something Pierce had spent 10 years believing he had destroyed. An audit log, a complete time-stamped record of every change ever made to the code. It bloomed onto the great screen without anyone asking it to, line after damning line for 1,000 phones to capture. There, in plain text, was the history Pierce had buried. The commits where he had deleted Holloway from the author field, one file at a time. The renamed documents, the forged signatures on the patent filings, his theft, written in his own hand, scrolling 10 feet tall above the stage. The room went from cheering to gasping. Every eye turned to the man frozen halfway to the exit. Security, the same guards who had gripped Cassius's arm an hour before, now moved toward Garrett Pierce instead. Maxwell Reed stood in the wreckage of his own arrogance, and for once in his life he understood that there was no clever way out. The cameras were on him. The truth was on the screen. So he did the only thing left to do. He picked up the $1 million check, walked to the homeless man he had degraded, and held it out with a hand that shook. "You won," Reed said, and his voice carried to every corner of the silent room. "A man I called a sewer rat just beat the best engineers in the world. A full minute faster, in front of all of you." Cassius looked at the check for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Keep the money," he said quietly. "I didn't come here for a prize. I came for my name." He placed one hand flat on the closed lid of his broken laptop, on the faded sticker, on everything that had been stolen. Put it back, on the patents, on the work, on all of it. He turned the photograph of Maya gently in his palm, and for the first time in 3 years, something in his weathered face eased. But the night was far from over, and the world outside had already begun to watch. By midnight, the footage had escaped the building and conquered the internet. A homeless man in a torn coat, 4 minutes, a billionaire begging, a thief exposed on a 10-foot screen. It was the kind of story the world had been starving for. The clip crossed 100 million views before sunrise, and across every feed and every screen a single phrase rose like a banner. People did not just watch it. They demanded something be done. #Justice for Holloway began trending in 14 countries before Cassius had even found a place to sleep that night. For Garrett Pierce, there was no escape and no soft landing. The audit log was not an accusation that could be argued away. It was a confession in his own hand, time-stamped and irrefutable, replayed on every news channel on Earth. He was removed from the building that night in full view of the cameras, stripped of his title before the sun came up, and by the end of the week he had been charged with fraud and intellectual property theft. The man who had built a fortune on another man's mind became the most hated name in the industry he once ruled. No company would touch him. No statement could save him. Everything he had stolen, he lost, and the world that had once applauded him turned its back without a second thought. Maxwell Reed did not escape clean either. His arrogant bet had been filmed from every angle, and "No one alive can outcode my engineers" became a punchline repeated 10 million times, set to music, mocked on every late-night show. When the truth came out that his flagship had been built on stolen work, the launch collapsed, investors fled, and Atlas stock fell like a stone. Cornered, humiliated, with nowhere left to hide, Reed was forced into the one thing his pride had never allowed: doing the right thing, in public, completely. He restored Cassius Holloway's name to every foundational patent. He paid out, in full, 10 years of royalties the man had been cheated of. A fortune that made Cassius wealthy several times over in a single signature. He stood before the cameras he had once played for sport and apologized to the man he had called a sewer rat, his voice low and stripped of all its old swagger. And then he did one thing more. He funded a new initiative, a hospital triage system built on the original Project Helion, the engine designed to save dying children, and he named it the Maya Holloway Foundation. Cassius agreed to lead it, but on his own terms, answering to no one. The titan who had stood at the top of the world now reported quietly to the man he had tried to throw in the trash. But the cameras, in the end, lingered longest on the smaller things. A key pressed into a weathered palm, the first door of his own in 3 years. A desk by a window. A warm meal eaten slowly, without hurry, without fear. A barber's chair, a clean coat, a full night of sleep beneath a real roof. None of it was given to him out of pity. Every piece of it he had earned, with the one thing the streets had never managed to take. And in his new office, in a place of honor on the shelf, sat the old laptop, its lid still cracked, the silver tape still holding, the faded Holloway Pierce sticker still clinging to the corner. Beside it, no longer hidden against his chest, but framed at last in the light where everyone could see her, was the photograph of a little girl with bright eyes and 2 missing teeth. He had carried her through every cold night to get here. And there was one last thing he needed to say about why. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. Talent does not vanish when a man loses his home. It does not dissolve in the cold, or wash away in the rain, or disappear because his coat is torn and his hands are cracked. What vanishes is not the gift. What vanishes is our willingness to see it. Cassius Holloway was a genius on the first day he sat under that bus shelter, and a genius on the last, and the only thing that ever changed was whether anyone bothered to look. The world walked past him for 3 years, certain it already knew everything worth knowing about a man like that, and the world was wrong every single time. I have told a great many stories in my life, but I chose to tell this one for a reason. Because too often the most brilliant minds among us are overlooked, dismissed before they speak a single word, judged by the color of their skin or the state of their shoes instead of the weight of their thoughts. A man like Cassius spends years being invisible, not because he has nothing to offer, but because we have trained ourselves not to see. And I believe, with everything I have, that real talent survives that blindness. It waits. It endures the cold. And when it is finally given 4 minutes and a fair chance, it can change everything. So look twice. The next person you are tempted to step around may be carrying a gift the whole world needs, and the only thing standing between them and the light is one person willing to offer a chair, a cup of water, a moment of belief. Be that person. Compassion costs you nothing, and it can give someone back their entire life. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments about a time you were underestimated, a time someone looked past you and got you completely wrong. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their worth was never up for a vote. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay for the next story, because there are so many more like Cassius out there, waiting for someone to finally look. #Justice for Holloway.